My husband told me he cheated because watching me give birth to our daughter ruined his attraction to me. He said this like he was doing me a favor by being honest. I saw things come out of you that I can't unsee. You're just not sexual to me anymore. You're like a medical patient now. He had started sleeping with his coworker Megan 3 weeks after I gave birth. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. While I was recovering, feeling exposed and exhausted, he was telling another woman how my body had lost its purity. He called me a spoiled ingredient, something that had turned rancid and unusable. He said he needed someone fresh, someone untouched, because his artistic soul couldn't create in an environment that felt unclean. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just watched him pack his bag. His movements precise and efficient, like he was plating a dish. He told me he was moving into the guest suite at his restaurant because he needed space to think, to reconnect with his muse. He didn't mention that his muse was a 24-year-old hostess named Amina, who had never created anything more complex than a reservation list. When the door clicked shut behind him, the silence in the house wasn't heavy. It was clarifying. I walked into his home office, the one he forbade me from entering because it was his sanctuary. The desk was organized with the same obsessive neatness he demanded in his kitchen. I sat in his chair and opened the safe. He hadn't changed the combination. It was his birthday. Narcissists are nothing if not predictable. Inside were the contracts, the original partnership agreements, the seed funding documents, the intellectual property filings. I laid them out on the mahogany surface. For years, Calvin had been the face of the glass house. He was the genius executive chef, the visionary who revolutionized modern cuisine with his philosophy of purity. But the paper in front of me told a different story. It was a prenuptial agreement addendum, signed and notarized 3 years ago when we were still just a sommelier and a sous chef dreaming big. It clearly stated that any intellectual property created prior to the opening of the flagship restaurant remained the sole property of the creator. And right next to it were my old tasting notebooks. The ones filled with flavor profiles, sauce reductions, and molecular pairings. The ones Calvin had used to build his entire menu. He hadn't created the signature sauce that secured our $750,000 investment. I did. I remembered the nights I spent in our tiny apartment kitchen, tweaking the acidity, balancing the umami, while he slept on the couch. I was the architect of his taste. I was the silent palette that made his career possible. And now he was calling me spoiled. I took out my phone and began photographing every page. Each click of the shutter felt like a deposit into a bank account he didn't know I had. I wasn't just a scorned wife. I was a majority shareholder in his success. He thought he was discarding a broken appliance. He didn't realize he was throwing away the operating system. Calvin didn't just leave. He escalated. 2 days later, he started bringing Amina to the house. He claimed the restaurant was too chaotic and he needed a clean environment to work on the menu for the upcoming gala. I would be upstairs nursing our daughter, and I could hear them in the kitchen. My kitchen. He was teaching her how to chop vegetables. His voice low and intimate, using the same phrases he once used to woo me. He called it mentoring, called it torture. But I didn't intervene. I stayed in the nursery rocking my baby and listening. I needed them to feel comfortable. I needed them to get sloppy. Then his mother, Brenda, arrived. She swept into the house with her usual air of dramatic concern, carrying a stack of brochures. She didn't ask about her granddaughter. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She sat me down at the kitchen table, patted my hand and sighed. "Emily, darling, you have to understand," she said. "Calvin is an artist. His soul is sensitive. The trauma of witnessing the birth, the mess, the noise, it was too much for his delicate creativity. He needs purity to create. You can't blame him for seeking that out." She slid a glossy pamphlet across the table. It was for a postpartum purification retreat. 3 weeks of juice cleanses, silence, and body wraps designed to restore your pre-baby state. Cost $4,000. "He loves you," she continued. "He just needs you to be restored. Once you're back to yourself, I'm sure he'll come around. Until then, you should be grateful he's finding inspiration, even if it's unconventional." I looked at the brochure. Then I looked at Brenda. For years I had swallowed her insults, believing that if I just tried harder, I could be the perfect wife for her genius son. But now, listening to her frame my husband's infidelity as a symptom of his artistic suffering, something snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet click of a lock falling into place. I realized then that Calvin wasn't sensitive. He wasn't a tortured artist. He was a man who couldn't handle reality. He viewed women as ingredients. When we were fresh, we were exciting. When we became real, when we bled, when we birthed, when we aged, we became waste. This wasn't artistic temperament. It was pathological narcissism. He had built a glass house to protect himself from the messiness of life, and he was furious that I had dared to be human inside it. I smiled at Brenda. Tight, polite smile. "Thank you for this," I said. "It explains everything." She beamed, thinking she had won. Thinking she had managed the situation. She didn't know that I was already 5 steps ahead. I stopped cooking. I stopped cleaning up his test kitchen messes. I stopped engaging with Amina when she floated through my hallway like a ghost in silk. Instead, I focused on the gala. The Glasshouse Gala launch was 10 days away. It was going to be televised. Investors, food critics, and influencers would be there. It was the night Calvin planned to unveil his masterpiece, The Origin, a dish he claimed symbolized the miracle of life. I knew exactly what that dish was. It was a raw, visceral composition of tartare and beetroot foam. He had been practicing the speech for weeks, talking about the sanctity of ingredients, the purity of creation. The hypocrisy made me nauseous. He was using the very imagery he found disgusting in me to sell his genius to the world. I needed an ally. Someone who had the power to burn his glass house to the ground. Called Rebecca. Rebecca was the lead investor and the city's most feared food critic. She was 55, sharp as a boning knife, and had zero tolerance for nonsense. She had championed Calvin from the beginning, believing in his vision. But she respected me. She knew who really curated the wine list. Asked for a meeting. I told her I had updates on the wine pairings for the gala. When I arrived at her office, I didn't bring wine lists. I brought my notebooks. I sat across from her and laid it all out. The infidelity, the comments about my body, the gaslighting. Rebecca listened, her face unreadable. She was a businesswoman first. Personal drama was usually a liability she avoided. But then I opened the notebooks. I showed her the dates, the timestamps on the recipes, the notes in my handwriting that predated Calvin's epiphanies by months. I showed her the IP contract. "This is the signature sauce," I said, pointing to a page stained with reduction. "And this is the concept for The Origin. I developed it 3 years ago." Rebecca looked at the documents. Then she looked at me. Her eyes narrowed. "He didn't just cheat on you," she said, her voice low. "He stole from you." "Yes," I said. "And now he's about to serve my work to the world and claim it's his tribute to a purity he doesn't possess." Rebecca closed the notebook. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered strategy. She asked me what I wanted. "I want him to own it," I said. "I want everyone to see exactly who he is. Not the genius chef. The fraud." She leaned back in her chair. "You know," she said, "there's a reason I never invested in just him. I invested in the team. I invested in the palate that could balance his ego. I always suspected that palate was you." She stood up and walked to the window. "The gala is live," she said. "There's a Q&A session after the main course. I'm moderating it." She turned back to me, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. "Wear something stunning, Emily. And bring those notebooks." I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. I stopped at a boutique on the way home. I didn't look at the size tag. I looked at the fit. I bought a dress that didn't hide my postpartum body but celebrated it. It was gold, shimmering like liquid metal. When I got home, I looked in the mirror. I traced the stretch marks on my stomach. Calvin called them ruin. But as I ran my fingers over the silver lines, I remembered a Japanese art form called kintsugi. Repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer. The breaks aren't hidden. They are highlighted. They become part of the object's history, making it more beautiful, more valuable than it was before. My body wasn't a failed appetizer. It was the vessel that had carried life. It had stretched and bled and broken to bring our daughter into the world. That wasn't disgusting. It was power. Calvin was afraid of that power. He was afraid of anything he couldn't control, anything he couldn't plate and garnish and perfect. But life is messy. Life is raw. And I was done apologizing for being alive. The night of the gala arrived. The glass house was spectacular. Walls of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the city skyline. The tables were set with minimalist perfection. Cameras were positioned in every corner, broadcasting the event to food networks and streaming platforms. Calvin was in his element. He moved through the room in his pristine white chef's coat, charming investors shaking hands. Amina was there, wearing a dress that looked like spun sugar, hanging on his arm whenever he stopped to talk. She glowed with the confidence of someone who thinks she's won the prize. I entered quietly. I wasn't at the head table. I was seated near the back, just out of the main camera angles. But when I walked in, heads turned. The gold dress caught the light. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't the mousy wife in the corner. I held my head high. Calvin spotted me. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then recovered. He whispered something to Amina, and she giggled. He probably thought I was there to beg, to make a last-ditch effort to win him back. He had no idea. The dinner service began. The courses were flawless. The wine pairings, my pairings, were exquisite. The room buzzed with approval. Then came the main event. The lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the center stage. Calvin stepped up to the microphone. He looked handsome, commanding. The tortured artist ready to unveil his soul. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as ganache. "Tonight I present to you the origin. This dish is deeply personal to me. It represents the sanctity of life, the purity of creation." Waiters placed the plates in front of the guests. It was the raw tartare, arranged in a circle, vibrant and stark against the white porcelain. "We live in a world that is often chaotic," Calvin continued. "But in the kitchen we strive for perfection. We honor the ingredients by keeping them pure. This dish is a tribute to that innocence, to the miracle of birth, which should always be beautiful." He paused for effect. I saw people wiping tears. He was good. He was really good. But I knew the truth. I knew that the man speaking about the beauty of birth was the same man who had told me I looked like a medical patient. The man who claimed to honor purity while sleeping with his hostess. The man who was serving a dish I created and calling it his soul. The applause was thunderous. Calvin bowed, soaking it in. Then Rebecca stood up. She walked to the stage, microphone in hand. The room quieted. She was the money, the power. Everyone listened to Rebecca. "Thank you, chef," she said. A truly moving speech. She turned to face the audience, then looked back at Calvin. "We have time for a few questions." Calvin beamed. He loved this part. He loved explaining his genius. "Chef," Rebecca said, her voice pleasant, conversational. "You speak so passionately about the sanctity of birth. About honoring the origin of life." Calvin nodded, humble. "It is the highest form of art. Can you tell us, then, how your personal experience with the birth of your own daughter influenced this menu?" Calvin froze. The smile didn't drop, but it stiffened. His eyes darted to the side. "Well," he stammered. "As I said, it's about the concept, the aesthetic." Rebecca pressed. "But surely, witnessing the miracle firsthand must have been transformative. Did you find the reality of birth beautiful?" The silence in the room changed. It went from attentive to tense. People sensed something was off. "Of course," Calvin said, sweating slightly under the lights. "It was educational." Educational. The same word the medical salesman had used. The universal code for "I checked out." Rebecca took a step closer. "Educational. That's interesting. Because I've heard reports that you found the reality of birth so impure, that you felt the need to seek out fresher ingredients." She gestured toward Amina, who was sitting in the front row, freezing in her sugar-spun dress. The cameras followed the gesture. Amina looked down, her face flushing. Calvin's laugh was nervous, high-pitched. "I don't think this is the place for personal." "And is it true," Rebecca continued, her voice hardening, cutting through his deflection, "that the very sauce you are serving tonight, the flavor profile that built this entire restaurant, belongs to the wife you called spoiled?" The room gasped. It wasn't a polite gasp. It was the sound of air being sucked out of a vacuum. Calvin looked at me. For the first time all night, he really looked at me. I was sitting there, calm, in my gold dress, holding the notebook. I lifted it slightly. Just enough for him to see. He turned pale. He looked at the cameras, then at the investors, then back at me. He was trapped. Rebecca turned to the audience. "We have a culture in this industry," she said, her voice ringing out. "We protect talent. We excuse the eccentricities of genius. We look the other way when brilliant men use people as fuel. But there is nothing brilliant about theft. And there is nothing pure about hypocrisy. She dropped the microphone to her side. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a verdict. The gala dissolved into chaos. Investors were whispering frantically. The livestream comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur. Calvin tried to salvage it, tried to spin a story about collaboration, but nobody was listening. The illusion was shattered. I stood up and walked out. I didn't need to stay for the debris. I had seen enough. The fallout was swift. By the next morning, the clip of Rebecca's questioning had millions of views. The narrative wasn't about a chef's bad marriage. It was about a fraud who had stolen his wife's work. Investors pulled out within 48 hours. They didn't want to be associated with stolen IP. The legal team for the restaurant group contacted me, not to sue, but to settle. They knew I had the proof. Calvin was barred from using the menu. He was left with an empty glass building and a lease he couldn't pay. Amina left him 2 days later. Apparently, her attraction to his genius faded when the genius turned out to be his wife's hard work. Brenda called me hysterical. She begged me to be reasonable. She said I was ruining his life. I told her I wasn't ruining anything. I was just taking back what was mine. 2 weeks later, I sat in Rebecca's office again. She slid a contract across the desk. The space is vacant, she said. The investors still want a restaurant. They just want the real chef this time. I looked at the contract. It was an offer. Head chef. Creative control. Ownership. I signed it. 6 months later I stood in my own kitchen. Not the restaurant kitchen but my home kitchen. It was quiet. The morning sun streamed in through the window. My daughter was in her high chair, banging a spoon on the tray, covered in oatmeal. It was messy. It was loud. It was perfect. I was cooking a simple breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. No foam, no deconstructed plating. Just nourishment. I thought about Calvin. He was working at a chain restaurant in another city, trying to rebuild from scratch. He wanted purity. He wanted a world without mess. He ended up with nothing. I looked at my daughter. I looked at the scars on my body, faint silver lines now. They were the map of my life. He wanted perfection. I gave him the truth. And it turns out, the truth is a dish best served cold. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself after someone tried to break you, share I am the architect in the comments. Let's remind them who really owns the power.